These are groundbreaking changes to Instagram and Facebook, and more significant and comprehensive than previously ordered by any court.
The way teens in America use Instagram and Facebook is going to change in a big way after their parent company Meta settled a huge court case with all the US states and territories. They've committed to make changes to the platforms and also to pay out $18 billion, although they haven't acknowledged any wrongdoing. What do these changes mean for the rest of big tech and the rest of the world? We'll discuss on the latest episode of Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and on Wednesday afternoon we got a bit of a news bombshell about big tech, which is that Meta, the parent company of Instagram and Facebook, had settled a legal claim with the US states who had accused them of harming the health of children. Now, Meta has not admitted any liability, they're not acknowledging any wrongdoing, but they are preparing to pay out billions and billions of dollars to the states, and they made some quite big commitments about changes to their platforms to make them safer for children. And that means the court case is effectively over. So there is a whole lot to unpick now that the dust has settled a little bit since Wednesday afternoon, because we're now recording this on Thursday afternoon. And the person who's going to help us, well, can you comb through or analyse dust? What's the metaphor? Anyway, the person who knows the details is the BBC's technology and AI correspondent, Zoe Kleinman, who's on the line now. Hello, Zoe.
Hi.
Now, we were recording the last episode of Newscast when the news came out that there'd been a settlement in this big tech case, but we thought there was still so much more to find out. We thought we'd leave it till this episode. So here you are.
There is a lot to talk about.
Yes. First of all, why did this happen now? I was sort of buckling up for a really long, classic American massive legal battle.
So was I. It was a complete surprise to me yesterday. I thought we were going to have weeks of courtroom drama. We were all anticipating Mark Zuckerberg, the boss of Meta, having his day in court and what he might say. And then suddenly, yesterday lunchtime, UK time, it was all over. Meta had announced a settlement. It has not admitted any wrongdoing, but it had set out very clearly not only the money that it was going to pay, but also the additional measures that it's now going to add to US teen accounts to put in more safety barriers, if you like, for their experience.
And so do we know why it went to court at all, if there was a deal to be done?
So this isn't the first case. I think you and I have talked about this over a period of many months, haven't we? There have been a succession of lawsuits going on against Meta and other big social networks in the US this year. And actually, Meta has really been the one that was determined to fight. It's put a lot of money and time and resources into fighting to defend its reputation. It says that it has always worked hard to protect children's safety and continues to do so. And actually, this case, on paper, technically, it wasn't really about online safety directly. It was about online privacy. There's an old US law called COPPA, which is about the protection of children's data. And it was that law that the 29 US states had used to get Meta into court. But of course, with only the first few days of the trial, what we heard was absolutely about children's safety, wasn't it? And it was a pretty bruising few days, I think, for Meta. We heard from a whistleblower called Arturo Berger, who used to work for Instagram. He says he told Mark Zuckerberg himself years ago that children were coming to harm on the platform. His own daughter was getting sent explicit pictures and direct messages at that time, and nothing was done about it. We heard from another executive who was shown a slide deck with the writing that sometimes Meta chose to pay fines rather than change what they were doing if they were found to be violating regulations. He said he couldn't remember having written that. So, we heard quite a lot just in the first few days of the case that I think gave a sign to Meta that this was going to be a rough ride. And the other thing to consider is what would have happened if they'd lost. They were looking at potentially hundreds of billions of dollars in fines. What they've actually paid or agreed to pay is up to $18 billion over a period of 10 years. So you can see that economically, certainly, that probably made more sense.
And my colleagues have very helpfully written down here on a shared document that $18 billion is £13.24 billion. Now, I think a good way of managing this conversation so it doesn't get out of control, because there's so many things to discuss, is to sort of split it into three things. Number one, the money. We've already started doing that. Number two, what Meta is offering to do to change its services as part of this settlement. And then number three, which is actually related to number two, the pressure Meta are going to put on their competitors, rivals, other social networks and companies to sort of do the same, because they're not standing on their own here, really. So number one, the money. We've done the number. That's over what? That's over a decade, and it's to be shared amongst 52 states and US territories.
Yeah, that's right. And it is all supposed to be channeled into child privacy and child safety initiatives, which, I mean, we'll have to see, won't we, how that pans out. It's definitely a big commitment over a long period of time. And it's really a tiny fraction of Meta's revenue. And I think, Adam, it's just worth remembering that as well. These platforms, its social networks, are really important to its business. You know, you might be hearing it saying, oh, no, it's all about AI now. We're completely focused on AI. Well, they might be. But actually, all of it is bankrolled by the vast revenues that it makes from its social network. So it's very, very important to Meta to protect them and for them to survive.
And they're also saying that they're only going to stump up 70% of that money this decade, and the other 30% will only come if TikTok and YouTube agree to do similar things. So there's sort of strings attached to this money that go via other companies.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll get on to all of that in a minute, but Meta is making the point that these measures are only going to work if everybody else does them as well, because of course everyone will just sort of jump ship to whoever doesn't have the limits and the restrictions that they are now going to put in. And they do have a point there, don't they? But I spoke to Arturo Bejar, the whistleblower, after the case. I spoke to him late last night here in the UK time, and he was saying, he made a really good point actually, that there is nothing in this agreement that the court has now signed off that relates to accountability. You know, it's all very well putting in all of these things, but are they actually going to make any difference? And how are we going to measure whether they've made a difference? And his point was, actually, if we're not holding Meta to account for its results rather than its efforts, that was the phrase he used, then they can just sort of throw whatever they like, in theory, can't they, at the networks? And maybe they make a difference and maybe they don't, but at least they've tried. And is that really good enough for those who've gone so far as to get this case to court in the first place?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And then there's the second section, which is actually the things that are going to change on Facebook and Instagram accounts for teenagers in America. And there's a whole massive list that takes quite a long time to scroll through. But the ones that really jump out at me are the idea of a 2-hour daily time limit, a new night mode that means that your Meta products sort of switch off when you're meant to be asleep, and school mode where they switch off during the school hours as well. Those to me seem like the big things. Yeah,
so there's a lot about restrictions on time and time at crucial points. So like you said, you shouldn't be getting notifications while you're in school. And if if you can't access the app between 12 o'clock at night and 6 o'clock in the morning, then perhaps you've got more chance of getting some sleep if you're one of those people that lays in bed doom scrolling instead of going to sleep. I certainly am one of those, but as I'm over 18, I'm not going to escape from it anytime soon, I don't think. But there are others as well. And I think some of them that are really interesting relate not so much to the sort of time suck, but they're a bit more psychological. So, for example, hiding the like count so that, you're not chasing that validation of how many people have liked your content and then comparing it to other people and feeling better or worse about yourself. Hiding filters that can be used on photos to make you look like you've had cosmetic surgery. That's quite a big one, isn't it? In terms of the unrealistic body image that comes up time and time again, doesn't it, as a negative thing that people see on social media that, again, makes them feel worse about themselves.
And also changing the experience. This will give teens the option to have a sort of old school Facebook style experience where you literally just see posts from the people that you follow rather than an algorithm plucking things from all over the network that you might like. And then this sort of autoplay of another video followed by another video followed by another video, having that switched off.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's going to become a much more bland experience. And that, I think, is what the campaigners want. I'm quite sure it isn't really what the social media companies want, because, of course, they need your eyeballs. They need you to be on that site for as long as possible so they can learn as much about you as possible, and not, in the case of children, necessarily monetize that data. But the minute they hit 18, start monetizing that data in terms of the advertising that they can show them. So it's not really in their interests commercially for people to not be on the platforms for very long. But that's got us where we are today, hasn't it, with people experiencing issues with screen time. And the other point to make, I think, particularly but not exclusively for young people, is the more time you spend on it, the more likely perhaps you are to come to harm, whether that's seeing some horrible content that you didn't want to see, or being treated badly by other people that you encounter along the way.
And also, you have to read the small print here, because a lot of these features are things that will be set to on as the default when you log on with a teen account, but there will be the option to turn them off. And Meta is saying, well, it'll be parents in charge of whether it gets turned off or not. But of course, that opens the door to teenage users just getting around the parental bit and switching them off or changing them themselves.
The parents have always been a very central part of Meta's child safety policy. And in a way, you can see why. Ultimately, as a parent, it's your job to look after your own child. But lots of parents have said to me over the years, and I understand it myself, that it can be so overwhelming for every app that your kids are on to go through the parental controls and set them up, and then hope that when there's an update, they don't somehow get scrambled and you didn't realise, or, you're opting in and out of stuff as they age up without quite knowing what it is that you're now opening the door to. A lot more stuff that Meta is now bringing in. It says it's bringing in by default. And as you say, if you're a teenager and you want that switched off, you've got to ask mum and dad to switch it off for you. And perhaps they will, perhaps they won't. It is a chink in the armour, isn't it, for sure. But I think it's interesting to note as well, it came out in court that Meta is aware, or certainly has been aware, that the features that they put in that are opt-in tend to have a really low take-up. Guess what? If you don't have to do it, you don't tend to do it. And they knew that, and they were still putting in features designed to protect children with that opt-in strategy behind it, knowing that it would be much lower than if it was just there and the teen had to put up with it from the get-go.
And that then brings us on to point 3, which you've already touched on, which is how Meta are going to try and pressure the rest of the industry to do these things too. And I'll just read out a little paragraph that is quite revealing of how they think that's going to work. So, for example, on the money, they say the remaining 30%, which is about 5.3 billion, will be released only after 2 specific conditions are met. 1, YouTube and TikTok implement a 1-hour daily limit, night mode, and age assurance measures, in other words, better age checks. 2, YouTube and TikTok each pay an amount matching the 30% figure, with half of the remaining funds tied to YouTube's payment and half tied to TikTok. And then you go down to the section labelled encouraging industry-wide adoption. There's then another list there of things that Meta say other companies will have to do if Meta's to do what they've promised to do.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, nobody has to do anything, do they? It's not become law, and these are mega competitive rivals. And they might say, "Well, no, sorry, when your 2 hours is up on Instagram, come and see us instead." But actually, I think given the social media backlash that's going on, not only in the US, here in the UK, and around the world in other countries too, they may have to follow suit, really. In a way, what we're doing here with the social media ban completely for under 16 is actually tougher than what is being proposed in the States. So, you could argue that we've already gone further here in the UK. That said, I do feel that this is the year that things are going to have to start changing. The vibe really is just that a lot of different countries now at a top level, never mind parents who've been saying for such a long time, please help us, we're struggling. And the social media product that emerges, I suspect, will be quite different to what we've got used to over the last 20 years.
And then, Zoe, I was just trying to work out what the teen experience of an app like Instagram will be in the UK in a couple of years' time. So under 16s presumably won't have access at all because of the ban. And then 17 and 18-year-olds will have quite a lot of the stuff that we've just been discussing arising from the settlement in the US, because actually that is stuff that the UK government is pursuing too, like stopping the infinite scroll and having blackout periods at night.
Yeah, I think it is going to become a very different beast, and probably not as much of a fun one, which is kind of the idea. But I guess if there are demonstrable figures that more children feel safer and are having better experiences, then it's an experiment. I mean, it is an experiment, isn't it, that's going to work. But there are lots of things to consider here. Firstly, more and more young people are talking to AI chatbots now about all sorts of things and asking it to give them all sorts of content. And that is really not currently, not only is it not in current legislation, but it's not really very tightly policed at all. And nobody sees that. That's not a public forum. That's just a private conversation between, you and the chatbot. There are some things coming in. So, for example, OpenAI, which runs ChatGPT, is bringing in teen accounts for using ChatGPT. And I think probably they're seeing the direction that the wind is blowing in and trying to get ahead of it, because undoubtedly it's going to catch up with them as well. And that's Meta's point, really, isn't it? It's all very well them doing it, but unless this is industry wide, people will just hop to the place where they can feel more free, perhaps. And the other criticism, of course, is this just kicking a big can down the road? On your 16th birthday or on your 18th birthday, you suddenly get unleashed on social media as we adults know it. And are you prepared for it?
Yes, a very good point. Also, I just wonder what these US attorneys general, because that is the plural of attorney general, what they'll go on to next, because they're presumably feeling quite successful at the moment, even though, as you said, Meta is not actually acknowledging any wrongdoing here.
No, Meta hasn't admitted to doing anything wrong. I mean, I suspect that we are seeing already more of these things bubbling up. But you've got to bear in mind, it takes quite a long time. The legal process wherever you are isn't necessarily renowned for being super speedy, is it? So this case took 3 years to reach the point that it did. And so maybe, Adam, we'll be talking in 2029 about the stuff that is currently slowly making its way through the system right now.
Zoe, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Now, a tradition in August is that the Home Office does a big data dump, and it's detailed numbers of the people coming and staying in the UK and the various routes they take. And it can seem a bit bamboozling, but there's always some key numbers in there that tell a story about our immigration system, which, as we know, is a big part of our political system. So, visas, in terms of the number of people who got a work visa, a study visa, or coming to join their family, they were all down by double-digit percentages. When it comes to asylum claims, they've fallen by about a fifth to 86,000 in 1 year, although there's some nuance there because we also need to talk about the number of people who are already in the asylum system, the so-called backlog, and we will. And then small boats, the stuff that we see on the news all the time, they were down 23% on last year, so 33,000 people entered the UK by crossing the channel in a small boat. So those are the headline numbers. Let's dig into them now with the man who knows them the best in the entire BBC, our home and legal correspondent, Dominic Casciani. Hello, Dom.
Hello, Adam. Hi.
Right, are we going to do a spreadsheet, or are we going to tell some stories, or is it going to be a mixture of the two?
I'm so sick of spreadsheets.
Okay. Oh, well, I never
we tell
could
a
be.
story?
Yeah, well, I think we have to do a bit of both, don't we?
Yeah.
So, first of all, what is the spreadsheet that we're talking about?
There are an enormous number of migration statistics which have been dumped today. It always happens in August, and you just get literally a zillion spreadsheets on the Home Office website, and it's really, really funny actually watching it across the media, because you're sitting there thinking, what are our competitors going to go for,
Right?
And what do we think is editorially the right thing to do? And this is real tension. And then normally what happens is, lifting the curtain a bit here for the audience, the press association will snap something very, very quickly. And then all the national newsrooms will go, do we go on that line or
is that
something
the
else?
best take on the numbers? Because I always find when I look at these numbers, it's just a reminder of how many routes there are to come to the UK.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about the immigration stats, there's lots of different routes. And so this is the numbers for all of them.
So in the sort of like the pre-planning, God, horrible phrase, in the planning for this earlier this
It's like we're having a meeting here rather than making a podcast.
I was saying to colleagues, I think we should really be looking at what's happening overall, the big helicopter picture with legal migration, because we know that the small boat arrivals are down this year. and the government has an optimistic story in its terms. It's trying to sell there, saying we're getting on top of this. So maybe we've told the audience enough.
Although when we say that they're down on last year, they're back to where they were in the years before.
Yeah, but still down from a peak overall.
Okay.
But just putting that to one side, we started thinking, well, okay, let's look at legal migration. So, work visas, family reunions, students, that kind of thing. And that was my instinct this morning. And if you looked at the figures, all of those are down, about 20% down, 20% fewer people coming on work visas and so on. Huge drop within that on people coming on healthcare visas.
That's basically been closed.
That's basically been closed, yeah. But that's quite a complicated story to tell, not least actually because, in fairness to the Conservatives, some of those restrictions actually date back to decisions that James Cleverly took as the last Tory Home Secretary. So effectively what you've got is the Starmer/Burnham era reaping some of the rewards for that. It was ever thus in politics. One party takes a decision and another sometimes inherits the benefit of that policy decision. I think what really became clear today is actually you need to stand back and actually look at what's happening with the asylum stats, because that is where the real political moment of tension is for this government. So actually throwing forward to, let's say we get a general election as late as 2029, a lot of the battleground in the red wall areas is about confidence around management of that side of the asylum system, and particularly around the hotels.
Well, yes, because normally the stat we look at for the asylum figures is the number of claims.
Yeah.
And that's for the last year was 86,000,
Yeah.
which is a 21% drop on the year before.
It is.
But you're saying actually don't look at the number of people going into the system, look at the number of people in the system.
Yes. Okay. So look, I'll take you back to a conversation 25 years ago. I remember being told by a very senior Home Office official back then when Tony Blair was dealing with all this about how to manage asylum. This particular official said to me, look, this is effectively, a sausage factory numbers game, because it doesn't matter how many come in, and it doesn't matter who's politically in charge of the country, red or blue. What matters is how quickly you can process them out, by which he means if someone's a genuine asylum seeker in need of protection,
They get to stay.
They get to stay, which means they can potentially pay their way, paying taxes and so on, getting a job. And if they're not, then you move them into the category of people who you would hope at some stage are going to be removed from the country. So the number of actual claims can end up being slightly academic if you're processing people fast enough.
Yeah, so the number of people entering the asylum system, so making a claim, that was 86,000 in the last year, which is a 21% decrease on the year before. But you're saying just as important as that number is the number of people in the system actually being processed at any one time.
The backlog.
Yes.
And this is a key thing. And the backlog reached an enormous number in the later stages of the Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Sunak governments. I think it was about 175,000 I've got the chart in front of me here, by the end of sort of 2022, early 23.
Because they basically stopped processing them, because in their dream scenario, a lot of those people would go to Rwanda under the Rwanda scheme. So you didn't want to process them if that was your worldview. That
backlog has massively come down. And in fairness to the Sunak government, they did start doing some of that work. Starmer came in, and Yvette Cooper, as first Home Secretary, said we need to put rocket boosters under this, to use a dread cliche. We need to spend more money on processing these people. Decision making started to accelerate, more people being processed more quickly, which means the backlog now is about 40,000 cases. Why that's important is the lower the backlog, the fewer places you actually need to put people. Yes. Which means you can start reducing the number of hotels.
Because when you're in the backlog, you have to be housed by the state.
Yeah. Now, normally, and there's a big, long Home Office contract on this, the vast majority of people claiming asylum are dispersed around the country into privately rented houses and flats, privately owned by landlords. It's a big mega contract worth billions that the Home Office runs. They started using hotels during the latter stages of the previous government, because they ran out of that standard accommodation. So they had to put people somewhere. At one point, we had 56,000 people in hotels, about 400 of them in use. So literally almost every community around the country would have been affected by that. It was a very visible sign of things changing, because you'd have good example. You'd have a little local community hotel, which would have been available for functions and weddings or whatever. And It's not. It's effectively become like a little closed accommodation centre, and that was starting to rub people up the wrong way. We've seen that for the last.
Well,
few
we
years.
all remember the protests, yeah.
The Bell Hotel, for example. I mean, that's a good example of that. They've made real progress on this. There's no doubt about it. The number of hotels now has gone from about 400 to about 160 across the country. The number of people in those hotels is halved in a year. So it's down to about 16,000 from about 32,000. It's a little bit complicated. It went up a bit after Labour came to office, but it's definitely on the downward trend. There are some areas of the country now where there are no hotels in use at all. And this then plays into the politics of this and the whole red wall thing. I'll just give you two examples from what you can see in the stats. If you think about Stoke-on-Trent, Wolverhampton, both areas which Labour would dearly like to hold on to, but both areas where Reform think they've got a shot at challenging Labour. Those are two local authority areas where there are no hotels now holding asylum seekers. And that's the kind of thing politically Andy Burnham will be aiming to sell back to those potential voters, saying, look, we're getting on top of this. We're making a difference here.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of political opportunity in this. I think the government's been very cautious and careful today. They don't want to crow too much about this because they want to see more progress. And I think the real question is what's going to happen by the end of the year in terms of arrivals across the channel. The arrivals are so far looking better than in recent years. If that trend continues and this ends up being a year with a significant drop in arrivals, that in turn feeds into the opportunities to reduce hotels further. Yeah. So,
although as soon as you stop putting people in hotels, you're then back to the world of putting them in the HMOs, the homes of multiple occupancy, basically bed sits, and that's a whole other controversy.
For sure. And that has been the case for many, many years. I mean, I remember when that first started in the Blair years and people were moved, for example, to Sunderland, and there was a lot of tension about it. But the thing is, it's not as visible. People are dispersed. You'll have one house here or there. So it doesn't, politically, it's not as obvious a problem. So I think there's often a calculation there that A, this is cheaper, but B, actually it becomes less visible. Now, whether that turns out to be the case, we'll see. The other side of that as well is the government is fairly determined to shift to a mass accommodation model where it can. Again, 20-year-old policy. This goes back to Tony Blair's days.
Basically putting people in big centres like old air bases.
Yeah, former air bases is the thing. You've got these places hanging around since the Second World War doing nothing, and the government basically wants to try and use them if it can. So there's been a lot of movement into those centres. Whether they end up in a situation with everybody in those centres, well, we'll see, because that depends on how many people are coming across and how better they can manage the numbers.
One of the other things that seems to have drawn a lot of people's attention is the number of people who are given settlement. So are then allowed to stay in the UK, not as British citizens, but basically given the immigration status that means they can stay in the UK forever. And that was 200,000 people in the last year, and that's up 24% from the year before. What's the trend there? And then, of course, you've got to include the people who come through the EU settled status scheme, where if you were here in the Brexit years or before the Brexit years, you then get to have settled status. And there's 336,000 of them last year.
So you've basically got a number of categories there of people coming into the UK in previous years, which affects the number of people who then seek to settle. So if you think about your stereotypical person who comes here legitimately to work, for example, after they come for a couple of years, they meet the love of their life, they decide they want to settle in the UK, they apply to settle, they're allowed to settle. That is the way of the world. It applies to all countries. So when you get, by definition, large groups of people coming in particular years, a couple of years down the road, you're then going to get a large number of people settling. So some of the categories which really affected this is the large number of work visas which came, work visa holders who came in during the Boris Johnson years,
which some people call the Boris wave,
the Boris
in a derogatory way.
Inevitably, that's going to lead to a large number of settlements because, by definition, a lot of those people are going to stay here forever because they've made their life here. Another one is what's called the British National Overseas Route. Now, that involves an awful lot of people who came to the UK from Hong Kong. For historical reasons, they had a right to leave Hong Kong, and given what they regard as the precarious situation of its democracy or lack thereof, a lot of people took the opportunity to leave and come to the UK because that was on offer to them. So correspondingly, a couple of years down the road, you will see that.
It's so interesting for me because obviously I was a political correspondent in that era. And so covering those news stories where it's things like, oh, there's a massive Chinese crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong. We must do something about it. They create this new route for British nationals overseas, which is what those Hong Kongers were called, to come and live here. But then, of course, that's just a temporary thing. This is them not becoming British citizens, but staying here for the longer term. So interesting, just sort of drawing the line from the past to now.
Yeah, and I think just on that as well, on that point about citizenship, the figures there are quite interesting as well because I've just lost it on my screen.
We've got too many spreadsheets, too many tabs.
So about 250,000 people got British citizenship in the year to June 2026, and that sounds like a lot. But it's actually a little bit down. It's about 4% down on the previous year. Now, the annual grants have remained high for a long time, and that is a reflection of the churn of people coming into the UK. I wonder, though, whether those applications have gone down slightly because of the cost. You can't just get citizenship. It costs about 1,800 quid. It's the process of actually proving you have a right to be British to seek citizenship is quite easy. You do the life in the UK test. You have to have, basically a settled life here and not be a criminal, essentially at the end of the day. But the actual cost, it's a great big check you write to the Home Office, makes it expensive. That's also going to become harder in time because the government wants to make it harder to become a British citizen as a means to deter people from arriving in the UK where they don't really have a genuine need to be here.
And then talking about settlement, Shabana Mahmood, when she was the Home Secretary under Keir Starmer, wanted to double the time you had to be resident here before you could get indefinite leave to remain, as it's called. So from 5 years to 10 years. Do we know if Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary under Andy Burnham, still wants to go ahead with that?
Well, I don't know at the moment, in as much as I think this is quite a delicate political choice for Labour, because the Home Office is looking at this in purely policy terms of this being a lever to try and push migration down. But there is an inevitable, effectively a soft moral question there for any government about whether or not it's an appropriate and fair way to treat people who have settled in the UK. If their life is genuinely here and they want to settle and they're being productive and contributing, why would you want to delay those people settling? I mean, there's also potential economic costs, particularly for people who are highly mobile. There are certain countries of the world where people are highly mobile. Lots of people from India who have qualifications make very conscious choices about, do I come to the UK to study and work and potentially settle? Or do I, for instance, go to Canada? And they are literally making those choices day in, day saying, do I take my skills there? And those are skills which may be in demand. So there's quite a complex fairness and economic argument there. And there have been whispers that the government may roll back from that. The political difficulty, I think, for the government in doing that is it then potentially becomes an opportunity for the government to be bashed.
Well, yeah, because when you look at the table that sets out how many people have been able to settle in the UK for the last 10 years, you realise that we're in a new world now where it's hundreds of thousands of people every year settling, whereas in the mid-2010s, it was more like tens of thousands.
It was. We. I think the best way of looking at this, Adam, is to put the UK in a global context, right? We are in an era, a really, really historic era of global churn of people. People come from wherever in the world to go to somewhere else. It goes both ways as well. You will have people coming from the UK to other countries seeking economic opportunity. That is the consequences of cheap flights, global qualifications which are recognised around the world. You get a degree in computing in India, it's going to be recognised in the UK and vice versa.
So the needs of the economy.
Yeah, all those things. I don't think that churn is going to go away. I think the issue is, I mean, going back to my Home Office official from 25 years ago, it's about confidence. It's about if you show you're managing the system, people sometimes there's an opportunity there for people to be less bothered about the figures because they're more confident that things are being managed. The problem with that, though, is it rubs up against other things. Housing, pressures on housing. That is a massive political issue, particularly in the poorest communities. It rubs up against very, very sensitive issues about cultural change, about what people feel their community should look like. And historically, Labour governments have tended not to really sort of engage on that. So if you think about the huge shift of Eastern European workers into the government, which began under the Blair-Brown years, or particularly during the Brown years, I don't think there was any real consideration given at Whitehall level to actually would this fundamentally change entire towns?
Yeah, what some people might call integration or lack of.
Integration, yeah.
Yeah. Dom, thank you very much.
Thank you.